Thanks everyone for joining. So what I'll focus on here, as you can see from the presentation, is building a process capability or a process center of excellence. And a big theme of this will be why it's important to understand your process environment through a process taxonomy, but that ultimately is not a one and done activity because once you build it, organizations are in a constant state of change. So you are going to have to build, if you follow this approach, build an organization that is responsible for governing the accuracy and the completeness of this. So a little bit about myself. Oh, there you go. Oh, sorry. So a little bit of an introduction. I spent most of my career as a consultant. So 10 years at Accenture, I'm sorry, 13 years at Accenture, 10 years at EY. And then I spent some time at Bank of America and Citigroup. My time at EY and Citi, I started as a technologist. I was a Java C++ programmer. I was a solution architect. I led large development programs. But I really came to focus on this process, this concept of process. And I started with business architecture, and many of you may be familiar with it. It really just maps everything an organization does from a capabilities that need to perform. But then I came to the realization, and through my work at EY specifically, I focused on a lot of transformation efforts. So defining strategies, running large transformation programs, doing technology design, risk management. And I realized that capabilities don't go far enough, that you need that connection with process because that's where the real work happens. And through that, I developed this framework called process inventory, and you'll hear about it in detail in this presentation. Um, but I developed a playbook and I implemented this process capability at a number of organizations to support their transformation efforts. I left Citi early last year, and I was head of the process excellence team for the U.S. retail bank. And I founded my own consulting company called Process Inventory Advisors, where I do consulting for companies looking to adopt this, and then also through this group, I will be rolling out a 3-day training course. Everything that I talk about in this webinar is covered in my book, which was released in December, called Digital Transformation Success. It really focuses on how to take this concept of process inventory and drive alignment throughout the organization, and how you use that to drive success in all your transformation endeavors. Um, so, so the theme of this is to win. I think organizations need to understand their process environment, and that requires you to document what your processes are and actively manage it through a process capability, or some people call it a process SUI. You may call it different things, but generically, I'll just call it a process capability. So, three things I want to cover through this is what does winning mean? Obviously, it's in the title, and I think we need to be clear on that definition. How process delivers success. I'll talk a bit about the concept of it and why it makes sense and how it drives alignment and system thinking, and then how to deliver a winning process capability. So I have a playbook that details this out, and I'll talk through the components that you need to document and think through in order to be successful with this concept. Sorry. So first off, let's define winning. And I framed it as a operational excellence concept, and you may call it different things, but really, to me, it's all about in your organization, how do you drive consistent execution, optimize performance and efficiencies across everything that you do as an organization? And what that looks like, it means consistent execution aligned to the purpose of your organization. It's a culture of continuous improvement, really getting people into that mindset of driving efficiency in everything you do. It's cross-functional collaboration. You probably know about silos and some of the challenges with it. So how do you get teams working more effectively towards your goals of transformation, or whatever you call it? It's being agile in the face of change, and that is the external world is in a constant state of change. So how do you build an organization that could react to those changes in a quick and efficient manner so that your organization's not losing market share to competitors, and then effective use of technology, which obviously is in a constant state of change with the advent of AI and other technologies exploding. And I just put in here some of the example measures that you could be looking at. And I'll just start with bottom line. It's efficiency. It's being, um, lowering your cost profile, reducing complexity in your organizations, driving higher quality, less issues and errors. It's driving stronger employee engagement, and I think that's through accountability. It's through giving them more autonomy to drive change and innovation, greater retention of talent. It's being more data driven in your decision making. So understanding what your organization does through greater transparency, improving your KPI metrics, even integrating AI, which I'll talk about in a bit, and then stronger risk management. So I come from a financial services industry background, which risk management is a very big agenda item. So it's all about understanding what processes you perform, what risks are in those processes, and how do you implement effective controls to make sure you're strong in that risk management department. And then if you go up, straddling the line is scalability and agility. And I think that straddles the line because it's all about how you manage change, how you deliver it effectively, getting to market in a shorter time frame and reducing that cost of change so that you can enhance customer experience and be receptive to their needs and wants because they can vote with their feet in today's competitive age. So making sure that you understand your customers from that perspective, you understand the processes that support them and any root causes of opportunities or challenges, and then ultimately leading to business growth. So a more efficient organization can enhance sales, can help you with mergers and acquisitions and inorganic growth, and help you roll out better products and services. So I frame this as why transformations fail, but I think and here's some stats that are kind of ubiquitous, but 70% of transformations fail, and just a transformation is just a large endeavor that looks to change how an organization operates or delivers value to customers. And it typically spans a large change of people, process, technology across, and organizations are very complex in today's day and age. They typically can take a multi-year, multi-project with significant budget, and all our organizations are composed of diverse teams with unique languages and perspectives. And I put in here, and I love to point to this because I think it's a great illustration of how kind of collaboration and silos can fail us. Is just the famous tree swing cartoon diagram where it says how a customer explained it, how an analyst designed it, how a programmer programmed it. And you could see these different languages and perspectives really make us interpret what we hear slightly different and just points to the need to get everyone on the same page. So, I think that my kind of thesis is that I think the 30% of why they succeed in today, it just takes a transformation leader with superhuman capabilities that works hard, has their pulse on everything, and is able to direct everyone to what's important and the goals of the transformation, which is obviously not sustainable at a large scale. So I'm hoping you find this solution useful to turning that 70% number around and driving your programs to more successful outcomes. Sorry, I'm obviously not good with my my scroller and my mouse. So I think there's two parts to being successful, and the first is system thinking, and it's understanding that our organizations are complex and transformations are a complex challenge. And really, systems thinking is a concept of viewing the organization through its connected parts, understanding the relationships and interdependency between those parts, and how they collectively impact performance. To be able to get to systems thinking, you need a ground truth, which to me is process, because everything, and that's the diagram on the right, if you understand your process environment, you could understand how it maps to your purpose and strategy, what customers are associated with it, From a risk management perspective, I already kind of mentioned that understanding what activities you take on as an organization, where there are regulatory obligations, where do you incur risk, how do you stay sustainable from a resiliency perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of getting to this concept really unlocks all organizational knowledge so that everyone has a clear and transparent understanding of how everything works and connects. It provides that common language back to the famous tree swing diagram, common language that you could point all your practitioners to so that you could get a clear understanding of what exactly has to change and who's accountable for it. It breaks down silos because it makes everything transparent in terms of what other teams perform. And it gets you to that data-driven organization if you make that data transparent to everyone. And just take a little step, into kind of this. And I always point to Google Maps, which to me is a massive data integration problem because you have restaurant ratings and traffic information, satellite photos, on the ground photos. And Google Maps, they actually have a team called the Ground Truth, but their ground truth is obviously the physical environment. Everything has to map to the physical environment. And that to me in a kind of non-physically tangible environment like a lot of our organizations process is that ground truth because everything starts with what you have to do and then you build your resources and all your information around it. The second part of it is getting alignment across people. So, and there's two parts to that, which is vertical alignment. So getting everyone from your C-suite and the strategic decision makers in your organization all the way down to your individual contributors and getting everyone to understand their role that they need to play in the transformation or the driving to operational excellence in a very clear and precise way. And then it's horizontal alignment, and this goes to collaboration, breaking down silos, but getting business teams, technology teams, risk teams, data teams, operation teams, all working collaboratively and coordinating effectively to make sure they drive that change in a way. So to get to those two aspects in a real tangible way, a common language is needed. Um, and that common language, if you were going to establish it, and I laid out a bunch of criteria on the right side, and I'll point to, there's a lot going on in the diagram. I'm sorry, on the left side, and then there's a lot going on in the diagram in the left or the right side, sorry, that I'll kind of cover. But first, it needs to be business oriented because if you're going to drive change in your organization, you need to maintain a focus on what is the value that I'm delivering for my customers, for my organization, et cetera. It's got to be comprehensive because there are a lot of processes or activities in your organization which may be bureaucratic and you may not think it's important, but those can impact performance because it could have a lot of unnecessary overhead. It's got to represent different levels of granularity. So it's got to be useful for strategic decision makers to make decisions at the top and for lower level practitioners, whether you're doing, design work or programming or risk management. It's all got to be connected in a coherent fashion. It's got to enable that cross functional collaboration that I mentioned. It's got to capture the unique processes of each organization, and that's the diagram on the right. You see business unit 1, business unit 2, business unit 3. It's really getting a detailed understanding of everything that happens throughout your organization. It establishes clear ownership and accountability, and you see in the diagram, there's a couple points of ownership. First is individual process owners within each organization. So who's responsible for managing that process, for the execution of it? And if you're doing changes, design changes, and making sure that everything is working towards its purpose. And then there's the global process owner. So if you're in a large organization that has multiple business units where you do maybe the same process in multiple different places, you need a standard capability model. Either that could be APQC or it could be a business capability model where you could map those individual processes to and see like processes across. And that's important for optimization, standardization, or even things like, hey, should I move this process to a shared service center or even outsource it? And you can't really make those decisions unless you have visibility. Um, And then last is aligning it with key operational data. And you see a process is associated with applications and a risk profile and controls and a bunch of other things. And if you could tie that process to the individual data within your organization, then really you become you get to really a repository of all operational intelligence where everything is understood. You could slice and dice the organization for impacts and really become clear on everything that has to change. So how do you create and I saw you jumped on camera. I should have started with this. If there's any questions, please jump in.
Yes, thank you. And I also wanted to reiterate that as well. We do want to make this interactive and make this for your needs. So if you have questions, hop in the Q&A. I did want to read one from Judy.
Yep.
Where does design thinking fit in with the systems thinking? Great question.
It's a great question. I don't think they contradict at all. So system thinking is just understanding the parts and just really gaining more knowledge on how the organization's constructed. And then design thinking is still a very valid concept in understanding kind of what's important for your end user, et cetera. So I think they work very well together. Great question, Judy. Any others or perfect? So how do you construct this process inventory or process taxonomy? It starts with an interview process. There's obviously techniques like process mining and other automated techniques, but at the end of the day, there's knowledge about what our organization does in various different places at various different levels of quality and completeness. And ultimately, to get complete and accurate, you need to go to each of the organizations from a top-down perspective and just ask a simple question. What is it that you do? And you take those answers, you convert it to verb, noun, process names, and you align it to the organization aligned taxonomy so that you have levels of what your leaders do, and then you go to their managers and what they do, and you go to their leaders, but you have this taxonomy of what everyone does. And then to make sure that everyone agrees with it, I always do bottom up attestation, which is, do you agree? And I start at the lower level managers, and does this represent all the full list of processes that your organization executes? Is it accurate? And then I go up to the next level, ask the same question, get a formal sign off via email or workflow, some electronic attestation, and then I go up so that everyone is agreeing that this is the accurate representation of all processes. Now, I always get this question when I talk through this slide, which is my organization's in a constant state of change. This is always changing, and that's a great question. And that's really why we're covering the process capability, but you need that process capability or team of people that is dedicated to making sure that they're governing this taxonomy and understanding where there's changes or even doing a periodic attestation to make sure that it's always accurate and complete and your business partners can trust that. Um, so so there's another concept called the unified model. And if you guys are process management people, you know that there's different types of models out there. There's customer journeys and value streams and capability models. And now I'm introducing process taxonomy and processes, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, to deliver on this, you need to build one model of your organization. So you need to understand and think through what these different model types do and how they connect together so that everything is connected all the way from those leadership decision makers all the way down to the nitty-gritty details of how different resources support. So and then how that connects to strategy. So there's the end-to-end processes, which is your customer journeys, which is an outside-in view of how your customers experience the products and services that you deliver. And then there's the value streams, which is an internal view of from concept all the way to delivering value, what are the various steps? But those are composed of individual processes. So if you could connect those to your processes in your taxonomy, which really details out what your organization does. And I already mentioned the tie to capability models. But each process that you identify through this process taxonomy, you could detail out in a process model, BPMN 2.0, or whatever technique you use. And then when you detail out those processes, You could attach various actors via internal, external third parties or customers, the systems that are leveraged, the data is leveraged. Really, the list can go on and on of the various metadata. But you really need to think through kind of how all this comes together in a coherent fashion. I'll just make one mention about AI. So, a lot of organizations are thinking about how to leverage AI. And in my view, a lot of organizations are using it on the periphery. Yeah, I could use ChatGPT to write a better email. I could feed a contract into it to understand, are the terms favorable to me or not, or what the concerns are. But I think that the next stage of AI is educating AI on all the nuances of how your organization works. Where are the redundancies? Where are the overlaps? Frankly, where are all the dead bodies buried? And if you could do that, and that's called a concept, it's called digital twin. If you could do that, now you could start feeding data with consistent process named data labels to this digital twin, and it could be your Lean Six Sigma team or your efficiency analyst to really understand where do you have cost inefficiencies? Where am I not complying with regulations, et cetera, et cetera. Really anything that you judge your organization by. Um, so I kind of talked about this earlier, but the data integration aspect is I think a key one. So all our organizations have data in various operational data stores, but they're all unconnected. They have different indexing systems. And if you want to do research on a problem in your organization, it takes a long kind of current state problem or phase to understand how everything connects so that you could start identifying solutions. But in this model, you take all that data and you move it into a business process analysis tool. And these tools, and I'll talk through it in a later slide, have really good capabilities and they build libraries. So I could take my systems, for instance, from my CMDB or my system repository, and that's the diagram on the lower right. And I could load that data in my systems library. Now, when I build this taxonomy or build my process flows, I can associate what system this process uses, or even what activity leverages a process. So now I start building that connectivity between my process environment that I've detailed out and all the resources and other operational information, such as my products and services, or maybe what entity this is running as part of. And really that gets us to, and I mentioned it before, but the full operational intelligence repository. So now I've captured everything my organization does with all the details, and it really becomes a powerful platform to understand what is my strategy, what are the impacts, how do I drive change, how do I do better risk management, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I put this in here just as an example to take it out of the concept or theory and just show you something real. And this is just the example consulting and training company, which is what I do. And you could see I break it out into different logical buckets of work. And it's things such as I deliver consulting services, which means I have to engage with prospects and create proposals, and I have to deliver consulting services. As I mentioned, I'm doing training, which is conducting webinars, and I'll be rolling out a 3-day training class, and I have to promote the methodology through LinkedIn, podcasts, conferences, YouTube videos, et cetera, et cetera. So it really takes this, what I do as an organization, and details out everything, and gives me kind of a single frame of reference for everything that I do, that I could drive any kind of change that I want, or efficiency. So how do you deliver a winning process capability? So I always start with a playbook. And if you're going to do this, take this approach and manage it, there's a lot of concepts that you need to think through, specifically within the context of your organization. First, you need to understand your process strategy. So what is it? What does this mean to you in your organization? What is your organization struggling with? What is your agenda? What is the vision and value proposition for creating this process capability? And then how will that be delivered within your organization? You need to think through the frameworks and standard, and that really goes to the unified model that I mentioned. What models are you implementing? What quality standards? How are you going to govern this information? How does everything integrate? And I'll talk through the details of it. And then lastly, how are you going to do this? How are you going to deliver values, which is the value case definition? And ultimately, it's one thing to document your processes, but it's really of no value if your organization's not using it, not changing the ways of working to leverage this information to drive better processes in all your operating processes. Your people and operating models. So you need to be very clear on roles and responsibilities, accountabilities. What are your processes, both internal to the process capability and external? And there's key roles like process owner and value stream owner, and really becoming clear on what all those mean and who's doing what so that you could hire and recruit the right talent and hold people accountable for via metrics, et cetera. And then lastly, tooling. So this is a fairly significant data integration problem. So you need a tool that could manage the data. You need impact analysis reporting. And I'll talk through. There's a lot of the good news is there's a lot of mature tools on the market that do this type of thing, but you really need to think through your context. What are your requirements? So you're selecting the right tool and then implementing it effectively. So the process strategy. So what are the components of it? And I think this is very important just to get clarity on what your purpose is and how you deliver deliver value. But you need to, typical things. What is your mission and vision? So why does the process capability exist? And what are your ambitions? So not just in year one, year three, year five, et cetera. And let me just make this point too, is this doesn't have to be an all or nothing approach, especially for large organizations. I would suggest starting small, maybe with one business unit, detail out your processes, build this information architecture, leverage it for value so that you could show your leaders and your champions and your sponsors what is what the benefit of this is, and then grow from there. You need to think through your value proposition and metrics. And that's a lot of what I talked about in the first slide is, do you want to increase efficiency? Do you want to be efficient in how you deliver change? Are you using this for risk management in your compliance agenda? Are you using this to drive that stronger accountability with your employees and innovation and driving stronger innovation? Are you using it to enhance customer experience? Using it to design your IT architecture so that's agile and aligned to the needs of the business? And there's probably many more value propositions and metrics you could add to this, and just kind of laying out a sample. You need to think through all your guiding principles. So what are the fundamental beliefs and values that guide your decision making, your designs and your actions? And it's a lot of what I talked about earlier is you want to be business oriented. You want to make sure that quality's forefront. You want to put strong governance processes. You really need to think through all of those so that your team's on the same page in terms of what's important. Your stakeholders are obviously important. You need to have a champion. Who's going to be the sponsor? Who's going to be the leader that's sitting at the C-suite table or some other leadership room that says, no, this is an important thing we need to do for our organization, and we need to support this team. We need to make sure it has the proper funding and resources, and make sure we're knocking down any walls or barriers that get in front of their way. And then some of the other stakeholders, and again, this is not an extensive list, but if you're using this for transformation, you have a head of transformation, digital transformation leader, or whatever it may be, making sure that they understand how this can be a tool for driving that transformation so you could flip that 70% failure rate on its head. A chief operation officer, if they see this as a way to drive more efficiency in processes, getting them on your side. Chief risk officer, if you're using it for risk, chief information officer, if you're using it for technology, et cetera, et cetera. Just being clear on who your stakeholders are, what they care about, what their value proposition is, and then making sure you're building in a cadence so that you're getting in front of them on a regular basis, monthly, every other month, or whatever it may be, and you're communicating kind of the progress, the value delivered, and some of the challenges. And then lastly, the value cases, which I'll detail out in a subsequent slide. Frameworks and standards. So I kind of already mentioned that there's a lot of different model types in here, and I put a meta model on the right-hand side. So it's really understanding what are the connections between all of these? How do they work together? And I put in here the different things you need to define. So what is that unified model? What is the integrated meta model? Maybe you won't use all of these model types, and that's okay. It really depends on your context. But what are the guiding principles? And that's guiding principles now even at a lower level. So what are your guiding principles for the model so that you could think through what your standards and what's important to you. And then all the different model types. So if you're using value streams, customer journeys, what do those look like? The value stages, how do they connect to capabilities and processes? um, et cetera. So for each of these model types, you want to define what it is. What are the standards for building them? Who's the ownership and stakeholders? And what's your method for construction and governance? And that goes back to your owners and stakeholders is who's going to look at this and say, yes, this is accurate and complete. I stand behind it so that you could use this as a foundation and any data input sources. So in this meta model on the bottom side, there's a lot of metadata that you could put into this. Where does that come from? Are those high quality sources? Can you trust it? What's the data refresh routine, and how are you um, uh, uh, managing conflicts in that data? So this is very, very important if you're going to take on something like this, just to get one view of everything your organization does in kind of one unified and coherent model. So if you're going to, and I've kind of laid out these 6 use cases, but if you're going to do this, is there another question, Laura?
Yes, we have a question from John. He asked, do you have some examples of metrics around value, flowing value, or showing value? He also asks, are you familiar with flow metrics by Mick Kirsten from flowframework.org? I'm thinking your measures and metrics are aligned to what he and his team are doing around flow, flowing value, etc.
So I'm not actually. So that's a great. I'd love to learn about it. So I will definitely research that site and integrate it if it aligns. In terms of metrics, it really depends. I've done this so I worked at Citibank, for instance, and they're going through a risk management transformation that's based on a 2020 consent order. So, their metrics are all aligned to, and I created a process inventory as I ran that team. I think we did about 75%, covered 75% of the processes for the US retail bank. And we were using that to take their data from their GRC risk repository and align it to the processes on the ground. And we were finding a lot of gaps. We are finding a lot of controls that didn't have any ownership. So really, it was all the metrics that a typical risk management program would cover, which is, what is the completeness? What's the effectiveness of my controls? Are we having better regulatory engagement? Things like that. I ran another transformation program. It was an insurance company that split off from another larger global insurance company. So it was all about performance of the transformation program. So are we hitting our budget numbers? Are we hitting our timelines, et cetera? And I'll go around the horn here, and as I talk through it, I'll really kind of cover some of the sample metrics. But if I start at 10 o'clock here, so this diagram represents everything you could use this process and process inventory concept to drive value in. The first is starting at 10 o'clock again is strategy to impact. So a lot of organizations define strategy at the top level, but they don't have that connection to the lower level processes in the ground. So if you could do that mapping in an explicit way, then now you could map your project portfolio and am I allocating money to the projects that are really aligned to what's important to me that's in my strategy? And that could be all the project portfolio metrics like efficiency and effectiveness of the spend, et cetera. You can manage the transformation journey, and that's everything I talked about. And you can use it to define your transformation strategy. And there's obviously many different types, from digital transformation, cultural transformation, mergers and acquisitions, and many, many more. But you can use this information to be much clearer on what's impacted on your in your transformation from a process perspective so that you could create and all the interdependencies so you could create a more accurate roadmap and hit your timeline measures and metrics. And you can manage the journey and understanding where's my cost? Is it aligned? Where do I have issues? How am I tackling those issues in a very clear and transparent way? Then going to the change process, which is on the, I guess, 3 o'clock side. If you have a full layout of all your processes, now I could be very clear on what my project scope is in terms of the processes. I could think through if it's a large change, what is my target operating model? So how is this change impacting my people, process, technology, my third parties? I could use this frame to develop requirements. So I could, and this is where the common language comes in, where business, technology, and everyone that's involved in testing where is involved in driving change can look at, okay, what is my requirement, say, for opening accounts? And you could understand all the technology and the risks and the controls that are associated with it. I could identify controls, and a lot of organizations and risk teams have this concept of shift left, where they get the risk teams engaged earlier in the requirements and design process, so they could think through what is the risk profile of this new thing I'm about to implement and roll out into production? And am I designing the right control so that teams can do it earlier in the SDLC cycle? I can use my testing. So a lot of organizations have automated test suites for regression testing. And if you could align all those tests to what are my processes, now it becomes this reusable thing that's more clearly aligned to what the business actually does. Uh, Performance change management. So when there's a large transformational change, there's typically change management teams that come in to educate on what the new process is so that when it's rolled into production, teams are educated. So that's procedures and training and job aids. So getting all of that aligned to what specific processes are changing really tightens that up. And I did that in one transformation program, and it worked out very well. Then moving on to operational excellence. So all about driving efficiency in your processes. So optimizing costs, reducing risk, improving quality, really looking at each individual process, which ones are most important, which ones have problems, and then better driving to what is the root cause, governing data effectively. And a lot of organizations have data management programs with stewards and understanding what data is leveraged in each of your processes and then tracing that through to which data repositories there really gets you better insight into, do I have the most efficient database scheme where I have maybe master data management for customer data, account data, et cetera. Do I have the right controls, especially if a vendor is dealing with social security numbers or other PII information? Optimizing customer experience, managing your supply chain, really anything. And I look at this as it's kind of like, think of Lean Six Sigma as typically, in my experience, they look at one or a group of processes and they do the DMAIC process to do a deep dive in the current state and design the future state. And this gives you all your information, so you could look at the organization from a 30,000-foot view level and find there's waste and inefficiencies that you could take out. Enterprise architecture design. So this is really arming your enterprise architecture team with more granular information for what the business does. So they could define their strategy, they can govern assets, they could do application portfolio optimization where they could say, where are there multiple systems that do the same thing? And should that be the case, or should I consolidate that into a central platform so I drive simplicity into my organization? And then finally, risk management, which is taking a lot of, in my experience in financial services, the big failure point in risk management is in risk data, because a lot of organizations, you have to align your risk and control work to what is the business context of your organization. And in many cases, they use a generic taxonomy like an APQC process classification framework. But the problem in large organizations, you have many, and when I was in banking, your retail banking team did much different processes from your mortgage and from your credit cards and from your wealth management, et cetera. So getting more details of what that organization does. In the old way, there's a lot of, interpretation of those risk assessments, and that leads to poor risk data. But if you could anchor all your risk information on a proper, true, and accurate view picture of what your processes are, then that will help in in all your risk management activities, and that drives better alignment across your three lines of defense. So your first line being your business units, the second line being your oversight function, which is typically aligned to your risk taxonomy, such as operational risk and compliance risk and operational resiliency. So getting everyone on the same page so you could do integrated risk assessments. It handles all types of risks that I have in the left hand. And then lastly, it provides better and more accurate risk reporting to leadership. And a lot of public companies now, that the SEC mandates that boards have a risk oversight function. So they need an accurate representation of risk. And if you could get more accuracy in what the organization does, and now you have a better roll up of how risk is managed, and it could help you with obviously your interactions with regulators and regulatory reporting. A lot there. Any questions? Let me take a pause.
I haven't seen any come through, but I'll keep an eye on the Q&A. If anyone has questions, please do chat them in or put them in the Q&A. We'd love to get those answered before we wrap up.
Yeah. And maybe that just means I'm nailing it. So this is just one example. I just wanted to show of how it helps with the change process. So if you look at the top, you break down your organization from various taxonomies. And as you're defining your project charter, and I highlighted these in green, I highlight all the processes that are in scope for my project that I'm driving. Now, if I take that frame, now I could drive requirements from it. I could do current state, future state process models. I could do risks and controls, designs. I could identify all my testing scripts, my conditions, et cetera. And I could do all my change management functions. But if you look at the bottom, there's a lot of different stakeholders that are involved in this process. And that's where the common language comes in, because now everybody is working from the same definition of what that process is, same understanding of how that process works, the data behind it, et cetera. And it really drives clarity into that. And one example, when I was early in my EY consulting tenure, I worked for a mortgage servicing company that was outsourcing a lot of work to a third-party vendor. And in that context, we had a large requirements team, but they weren't anchored to anything. So they were just running around documenting what the business said, but there was no structure to it. There was no denominator or definition for complete. So we came in and we mapped out a full process inventory and defined processes. Now that gave them the structure to drive completeness, and they went from in clarity on who they needed to talk to, et cetera. So that took them from bright red and the project was in trouble to bright green, where we're hitting all our timelines, and everyone was much more satisfied with the outcome we were driving to. So you're in your people operating model, and again, this is more from a process documentation standpoint, and it certainly can adjust if you have other parts of your process capability in here. But there's a couple things that are important. You need leadership, obviously, that buys into this concept, is a believer, that drives their teams towards things that are hard to get to, which is quality, and you need some rigor in that leadership so they're directing the team. You need modelers that go out to the organization and interviews the business to document what those processes are, to create processes, or to create process models, align all the data, make sure you get all those attestations. You need demand management, especially if your organization's complex and there's a lot of people that need it. You need to be able to prioritize based on the resources you have and the demand for your work. You need to maintain process standards, especially if you're doing this in a federated fashion. A lot of organizations will have process modelers in different parts of the business, but you need to have one central group that is managing what does good look like and is distributing those so that everyone has a checklist for how do I ensure quality, how do I get approvals through your governance, and that's your next one, your governance of process assets, making sure that anything you check into your repository is accurate, complete, aligns with standards, and has things like it's readable and understanding across the business. And then lastly, you need a team that manages this whole platform and data. So what are the access rights? What's the data integration? How do I load data? What's my timing for that loads? How do I make sure I manage any conflicts, et cetera? So really important if you're driving capability or process center of excellence. And then last one, I'm a big believer in process taxonomy. So I think a process capability needs a process taxonomy as well. And this just shows kind of some of the different processes that these organizations would do, which is, deliver process inventory. Someone has to construct the inventory, do the periodic refreshes, perform change requests, fulfill ad hoc requests. You need standards to maintain the modeling and standard checklist. You have to deliver training, especially if you're in that federated environment. You need to do quality reviews. Quality to me is so important because if you're building this and your stakeholders don't trust that it accurately represents what they do, then they'll lose trust in it, and that'll harm your efforts. Hi, Jacqueline.
Yeah, I was just asking people if they could put their questions in the chat or the Q&A. I see some hands raised, so just want to give everyone that opportunity to type in your questions. Unfortunately, we can't unmute everyone, but I did have one question come through from Judy. How long did that process take you to document?
That's a great question. So I separate it in two things. So the process inventory versus the process models. And I think in a lot of cases the process names are just as important, or maybe not even, or maybe even more important, because you could do all the data alignment, you could do risk assessments off it, et cetera. So the documenting what your processes are is actually a fairly efficient activity. So I always start with in my teams. We ask for any documentation we could research, because I don't want to come to any interview with a blank sheet of paper. So I create a process inventory with as much information as I can, and then I have the sessions with the stakeholders, and then really it's two meetings. So the first meeting is what did I get wrong in this? Where are there gaps? Where are their adjustments? Having in their own words tell me what the processes are. Then I'll have my teams go back and we do all the data alignment that's appropriate. We fill out definitions, et cetera, and then we go back for that validation session. So to give you a frame of reference, when I was at Citibank, the U.S. retail bank, I estimated there was probably about 10,000 processes in total. I had a team of 4 people, so we had to be very efficient and nimble. We did about 75% of that process inventory within the time frame of about 9 months. So you could do that very efficiently. Once you have that foundation, now you can work with your stakeholders and say, what are the priority processes? Define your criteria for when you go to process modeling, because that's a much longer activity. And then you could prioritize based on the demand and what's important, what models you're creating those detailed views of. And many times it's associated with a problem, a project that needs to happen, or some other details that need to be clearly laid out. But yeah, this should not be a scary exercise. I think just creating the process inventory, if you do it right, is very efficient. Any other questions, Laura?
Not so far.
Okay,
Oh, wait, before I say that, one just came through. Yes, we will be providing a recording of the session as well as the slide deck afterwards. So give us a day or two, but those will be coming by email. Thank you.
great. All right, and my last slide. So as I mentioned, if you're going to do this, you need a platform to manage all this information. And that's typically the good news, and I put some logos in here. I want to caveat, I make no assertions that this list is complete, and I'm not going to make any recommendations as to what tool is the best. I think you need to do your own research based on your own context of what's appropriate. But I will tell you, these are very good tools. Eris, GB Tech, Mega, iGraphics, Signavio, Evolution, BizDesign. And they've been in the market for decades, and they have matured a lot of these capabilities. And I put the capabilities at the right, which is modeling, just creating all these models, creating the taxonomy, organizing your information. A big thing is process mining. So if you're not familiar, process mining is a technique where a process mining tool will scan log files. It could generate process information. It could really fill in the gaps of what maybe your process owners don't really understand or remember. And it could also do validation on what your process owners say happens in the process versus what happens. But ultimately, and this is my view, is what process mining, one thing process mining can't do is give you context for what that process means for the business. And that's where the process inventory, process taxonomy comes in. So the outcomes of a process mining should be mapped to that process inventory. Data management I mentioned, so it's a fairly large data integration effort. So these tools do great work in terms of managing all that data and giving you different things like workflow, et cetera. Process analysis, and I think this is one of the most important things is impact analysis to me is if you're doing a project like I want to retire maybe my ERP platform. If you have all this mapped out, now you can understand what are all the processes my current ERP does, who are the owners, what is the details of that process in it, so that I could do an RFP for a new platform. I could understand what's in scope. I could be much more efficient in driving that project. Reporting, and there's standard reports, there's ad hoc reports that you could create, and then governance. So you can manage all the attestations that I mentioned. There's workflow. There's a lot of really important capabilities in these platforms. So that's all I had for prepared slides. So let me open it up for questions. What other questions do you have? Is this resonating? Is it making sense? Um, yeah, I'd love to
Yeah,
hear any questions or
please
feedback.
do put some questions in the chat or even just thoughts if you want to just riff a little bit on what this might spark for you. If you had some ideas or just some um, you know, feedback is always good. We always want to hear how the webinar lands for you all. So we appreciate if anyone has any thoughts to share. I know for me, you know, of course, hindsight is 2020. These are great tips and I can always reflect back and think, man, this would have been a good thing to do before we did such and such project. It's kind of what I'm
Yeah,
thinking. I don't know if anyone else is like having similar thoughts of looking back and said, man, this would have been a really good thing to have. But
yeah,
hopefully moving forward, this is something that is something you'll look to implement and look into. This looks like
yeah.
some great tools as well to look into.
It,
Go
and
ahead.
I'll also make a plug. I have a standard playbook. I have all this documented. So if anyone's interested in learning more about it, reach out to me on LinkedIn, send me an email. It's in the presentation. Love to have a conversation and see, if this lands for your organization.
Great. Thanks for the session. Very robust and insightful. That's some feedback we're seeing in the
Thanks, Phil.
chat. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate you. Have some feedback. Process models in general are wrong but useful because it is difficult to model all the ins and outs of a process. What level of detail do you model the processes?
It really depends on what you're doing. And so for instance, if you're doing risk management, maybe the process names are just good enough. I was in one project at a capital markets company that was concerned about operational resiliency because all of their core processes were on COBOL and the mainframe. So we mapped this out. We actually went further than process and we went into the system flow aspect of it. So detailing out business rules, et cetera, so that they could be armed with what requirements are for if they wanted to move to, say, maybe a microservices environment. So it really depends on your context. Your point about, they're always wrong. I think this approach gives you structure because now you know the bounded context of each process, what starts, what ends, and then if it connects with other processes, you could draw those connections, but it is still all in the context of what your business does.
Great. Anyone else have any questions for Michael before we wrap up? Hopefully you saw in the chat that Michael's one of our speakers at Gen AI Day, which is a virtual conference coming up on October 30th. So if you're interested in learning more about the digital twin concept, please join Michael. And we have a panel of about 8 other speakers that will be presenting on generative AI, all about enterprise adoption. So we'll be focusing in on best practices, tools, tips, missteps, all around generative AI adoption in the enterprise. A couple more questions coming through. I'm wondering if the DMAIC model is simply a roadmap for Six Sigma and how to build a robust process operation excellence using Lean Six Sigma.
Yeah, I look at Lean Six Sigma. So I think these are maybe a related concept. So this process concept I'm talking about is really just detailing out everything your organization does. DMAIC is define your problem, measure it. It's really an approach for kind of doing a deep dive in what the challenge that you're researching is, and then coming up with solutions. So I think they've worked very well together. And I think what this provides is it shortens in a lot of efficiency programs. There's a long current state exercise where people just don't understand everything. And this really shortens it because it gives you all that data at your fingertips of how things work. So you could zone in on what the problem is and get quicker to solutioning.
Okay, great. And we have another question. Is your experience primarily in the private sector, and is your material geared for the private sector? My
This
experience is in government, 20 plus years, and has additional complexities.
I think this is useful for all industries. I always say this is agnostic. I did work at I was never in government per se, but I did work at a GSC, which is kind of quasi government, obviously. So I think it works for everything. So I think every organization can benefit from this transparency.
Okay, great. Any last questions, anyone? We have a couple more minutes. Love to hear from you if you have anything to contribute, any questions. Lots of thank yous in the comments. Lots of good feedback. And again, I'll be emailing you the PDU credit, the recording, the slide deck, and hoping to see you all again. Our next webinar is coming up October the 22nd. And we have a new website, skillsdg.com, where you can find all of our upcoming events and trainings and courses. Drop that in the chat as well. But anything else in closing, Michael, that you'd like to share?
No, thank you for the time. And if you guys are interested, please reach out. Love to have a further conversation.
Great. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.